A video posted on Instagram Wednesday showed James Harden and Chris Paul playing a pickup game together for the first time since CP3 was dealt to Houston. Since both Harden and Paul are used to having the ball in their hands, still plenty of questions about their ability to coexist. Bomani, how should Rockets fans feel about this?
First of all, I want to know more about who was on the other team, because I feel like once Chris Paul and James Harden are on the same team, I'm going home. All right, like, there's nobody else that we're going to play with. Now, as this goes, them playing together, okay, it's a pickup game. We'll see how this ultimately works out. How this relationship goes, though, we're not going to find it out in the first week. We might not find it out in the first year. We are going to find out James Harden playing with Chris Paul. Are you sure you're cool with this, right? Because I know that you want to be off the ball and be relieved of that pressure. The one thing, though, is Chris Paul's the dude in charge. No matter how this goes. Chris Paul has been in charge of probably every basketball team that he's been on since he was in 7th grade. You're not going to work around that. And it can be withering in the way that we talked about with LeBron and Kyrie Irving, right? Like, it can be tough. You think the DeAndre Jordan chronicles him jumping up and down and pointing in his face and everything else. That's what you get. Now, it is a transition to go from being the man on the team like you've been with the Rockets, and then if Chris Paul comes in and he winds up being the dude in charge. Maybe that's what Harden wants. Maybe that's what Harden says he wants. That's the transition that I ultimately want to see, because if you think that Kyrie, thinking he signed a contract to be the franchise centerpiece, and then they bring LeBron in, if you think that was understandably difficult to deal with, which I think all of us do, imagine being James Harden. You just had the second best season in the NBA last year, and now this dude's coming in, and even if he says, nah, it's going to be both of our teams, Chris Paul is not built for that.
Chris Paul is a micromanager. I had a friend from college who went to high school with Chris Paul, and Chris Paul was the class president. Chris Paul is trying to organize their reunion many years later. Chris Paul, as I've read descriptions of him, is the guy who is barking out driving directions from the back seat, because he knows how to get to where he wants to go better than you know, better about how you want to go. So that is the Chris Paul story, but I will say, James Harden is someone I interviewed back in 2015, and James Harden at that point talked about how Ty Lawson, the point guard who flamed out with the Rockets, was somebody he wanted to acquire because he wanted to play off the ball more. He wanted to cut and slash more like what he did in Oklahoma City. And obviously, in between 2015 and between now, the Rockets got Mike D'Antoni. James Harden got to be the convertible that Mike D'Antoni had always dreamed of, and the offense changed. But James Harden, I think, has that seed in him where he realizes that if I'm going to get to another level, there is some part of my game that has to change. And, Bo, this is the thing that I think about, too. Remember the last time we saw James Harden play NBA basketball? He was soiling a California king-sized bed.
Yes.
Whatever ego and love that James Harden developed for Mike D'Antoni, the way it ended, I think, has to be one of these existential gut checks that says, if I'm going to avoid doing this, we're going to have to do some stuff differently, even if it means bringing in the guy who shouts driving directions at me.
Yeah, but everything you're talking about is about the game, right? Like, everything you're talking about is basketball. And in basketball terms, that makes perfect sense. And it is interesting to consider the idea that a guy who got to have the ball as much as Harden did, and a guy that we think of as being ball dominant like Harden is, saying,
yes,
no, this isn't actually what I want to do. But the question I've had about Daryl Morey for the entirety of the time that he's owned that team is, he's real good with the basketball. It's the people stuff that he doesn't necessarily get. That is how you wind up with Ty Lawson, for example, because you're saying to yourself, hey, we can get this guy in and allow James Harden to move off the ball, completely ignoring all the people things about Ty Lawson that led to him ultimately flaming out with that team, right? So the way I look at this with Paul, this can really work, but it's going to be interesting to watch how this goes. Is James Harden, who's now been in the league, 8 years? And Chris Paul, I'm guaranteed, remember the same thing with DeAndre Jordan. Chris Paul was like, oh, my bad. I didn't realize that I was getting on your nerves so bad. Everything's, we'll figure that out. I asked somebody that last year with the Clippers. I was like, did it change? They just laughed. I mean, like, he is who he happens to be. So basketball-wise, I think this ultimately will prove to be fantastic because James Harden played point guard, but he's really a two guard. Basketball-wise, this will be great. I just want to see how they interact with one another.
Let's take it one step hypothetically further and say that they do end up getting Carmelo Anthony. How does that change that dynamic?
Well, the thing about Melo is I think Melo is most willing to ride shotgun than anybody else. Like, nothing about Melo gives you assertive, really, in that way, personality-wise. Or even as a player, and we see in the Olympics, everybody loves playing with Melo. So if you put Melo in a situation where really all he has to do is catch and shoot, which, by the way, he's really, really good at, I think Melo will ride along with it just fine.
But that's the thing about this whole personal chemistry question, and where I do defend Daryl Morey a little bit. The people stuff, Dwight Howard, right? That's another case study in misevaluating maybe personal chemistry. He and James Harden did not get along. We all know this now. But in the NBA, the degree of difficulty in winning a title is so high that you got to take these chances, because you're going up against the Golden State Warriors, and Carmelo Anthony and Mike D'Antoni famously did not get along in New York. But I agree with you. If you get a version of Melo that is willing to be the Team USA Melo, if you get a version of Chris Paul and James Harden where they're willing to play on different lines essentially, so that Mike D'Antoni and Daryl Morey can stagger lineups and they're not burning these guys out like James Harden was burnt out in the regular season, then they're pretty well suited to make a playoff run.
Don't worry about Melo. I don't. And never forget this. He played with Allen Iverson and J.R. Smith at the same time. It's like we really don't give him credit for the fact that he has been willing to adapt his game at points based on the roster. The best season he ever had was 2009, where he averaged something like 22 points a game coming off the Olympics when they brought Chauncey Billups in. He has demonstrated he would adapt. The Knicks did not have any. Why would he pass the ball to them? I wouldn't pass the ball to them. Not if I was Melo, if I was me.
Chris Copeland is offended right now. How dare you?
X Factor.
The X Factor.